Very good. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are. Welcome to another session on capitalism, rethinking capitalism and economic order. I'm Shatwik, along with my friend Koshal Mit, who is based in Cambodia. We are organizing this series to explore our curiosities. We are extremely lucky to have with us Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon, who is a full professor of economics at Laurentian University, Canada. He received his PhD from New School of Social Research in 1998, where his dissertation on indigenous money and the post-Keynesian economics received Frieda Wendell Award for Outstanding Dissertation. His research focuses on monetary theory, policy, post-Keynesian economics, central banking, and fiscal policy. Professor Rochon is an editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy and the founding editor emeritus of Review of Keynesian Economics. He's also co-editor of the Monetary Policy Institute, editor of Monetary Blog, and the editor-in-chief of Elgar series on central banking and monetary policy. He has published widely, extensively, with around 180 scholarly articles, nearly 60 authored or edited books, including recently published Encyclopedia of Post-Keynesian Economics and a brief history of economic thought. He has been a visiting professor, scholar in several countries, and has lectured widely across the world. So welcome, Professor. Thank you for your time. And today he's going to give us a short lecture, which will be followed by a question and answer session on monetary policy during and after the Trump era. So welcome, Professor, once again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me. Very happy to be here. I'm in Brazil lecturing right now, a series of lectures and conferences. So I'm not in my home in Canada, but nevertheless, thank you for inviting me. And today's talk, I want to talk about monetary policy in the United States, but also monetary policy around the world, as it's difficult not to mention what's happening around the world as well. So I want to start with a few statements about central banking, about monetary policy. As journal editor, I get a lot of papers, submissions, and I'm just surprised and shocked that I don't get many, but I still get papers, more from mainstream authors, of course, who talk about monetary policy in terms of money supply. Central bankers, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here to be provocative, but central bankers don't care about money. They don't measure money anymore, M1, M2. It's just these leftover monetarists who still care about these aggregates. What really monetary policy is about interest rates. And most central banks around the world, or a great many of them, adopt an inflation target. So this is, central banks who agree that the inflation rate should be something like 2%, for example, or a corridor. And that's your official target of inflation. And they try to bring inflation down to that level when inflation is above. And what they do is they use the interest rate and they do fine tuning. So they increase the interest rate when inflation is higher. They bring down inflation when they bring down interest rates when inflation is below target. So they do this fine tuning with the aim of always trying to have inflation at the chosen target. That, in a nutshell, is what monetary policy is today. And we call it the new consensus model, the Taylor model. There are a few names for it. But that's essentially what monetary policy is. And they will, of course, also consider output gaps or unemployment in their decision to set interest rates. But I think these are secondary objectives. The main objective is inflation. And maybe in a time of crisis when unemployment rises or the economy collapses, they'll bring down interest rate. And we've seen that they've brought it down during the financial crisis and during the COVID crisis. They brought down interest rates to 0%, the lower bound, as it's called. And more or less, when you see inflation increasing, it's a good indication that maybe central banks will start raising interest rates. And that's what happened in the post-COVID era as the economy opened up and inflation shot up. Now, it's important to understand why inflation went up, why inflation goes up, because the reaction of the central bank can be very different. First of all, if inflation is considered to be more permanent or long, as opposed to short-lived, that might influence also central banks. But with respect to post-COVID inflation, what happened here is that the inflation was mostly caused by the war or by structural problems, the oil price going up, etc. And that led to an increase in costs, an increase in overall inflation rate. The question becomes whether the central bank, the Federal Reserve, should it have increased interest rates then? Let me be clear about my own position. I think central banks should never use monetary policy to fight inflation. There's a disconnect between inflation and monetary policy. And the reason is that monetary policy, the interest rate, using interest rate, increasing interest rates, works on inflation provided inflation is demand determined. So if inflation is the result of people buying too much stuff, supply and demand goes up, pushes inflation up, then the response of central banks should be to increase interest rates in order to bring inflation down, demand down. But the problem with that for me is that that's problematic in itself. But in the post-COVID inflation case, inflation was really not caused by demand. It was caused by other forces on which interest rates don't have an impact. Because the central bank increases the interest rate, it doesn't mean that it will have an impact on the oil prices resulting from the war in Russia. So the decision to increase interest rates at that time was a wrong decision. Now, again, for the record, I think it's always a wrong decision because I think inflation is rarely caused by excess demand. Inflation in the post-Keynesian model is caused by conflict over income distribution, costs of production. So interest rates don't really work on these things. They don't at all. So it's pointless to raise interest rates. And in fact, at the beginning of the post-COVID inflation period, central banks did say, no, we're not going to increase interest rates. This is going to be a temporary increase in interest rates. Now, they ended up being correct about that, but they did raise interest rates nevertheless. Raised interest rates 10 times in the United States, 11 times in Canada. And, especially in the United States, those increases had very little effect on output. Output continued to increase. And that's because they had a huge fiscal stimulus at the same time. But inflation came down on its own once some of these problems, bottlenecks and etc., were resolved on its own, on their own. So inflation came down irrespective of central bank policy. Now, to go back to the post-COVID inflation, one of the explanation that's consistent with the mainstream view that inflation was caused by demand is that if you look at the data, you know that during COVID, savings rates went up. That's because we had nowhere to spend our money. Restaurants were closed, bars were closed, etc. People couldn't spend their money. So they accumulated savings. And once the economy opened up, so the story goes, people rushed out and bought all sorts of stuff. Demand increased and raised prices. And that's the explanation for the post-COVID inflation. But I don't think that's the correct story. As I said, I think inflation was caused by other problems like bottlenecks and war and etc. And maybe even a little bit of some greed inflation thrown in for good measure, what Isabella Weber has been working on. So, if you increase interest rates, it won't affect the greed of corporations. So it was a wrong policy. Absolutely wrong policy. I think inflation is better solved using fiscal policy, but we can talk about that in another video. So, and I think that in many countries, they followed the same sort of principle, raised interest rates. And of course, once the United States raises interest rates 10 times, other countries really don't have much of a choice, except if they agree to let their currency fall. Now, Japan agreed, and Japan suffered for it in that sense. The currency fell, the yen fell very dramatically. So, I mean, I went to Japan in that time, and the exchange rate was absolutely, well, it was great for me, right? So, but normally other countries will follow suit. Canada followed suit. We raised interest rates 11 times. Um, so the US certainly dictated monetary policy post-COVID. So to recap, I think it was the wrong policy. The right policy, I think, to fight inflation, as I said, should have been fiscal policy or other measures. Isabel Weber is doing great work on buffer stocks, for example. An old idea that goes back to Nicholas Caldor, by the way. But that's one way. Others had ideas of taxing extra profits to curb the greed inflation. I had my own idea of having some sort of price control. So, which I think was the better policy. Price control was the better policy because it would have given benefits directly to the household where, you basically drag prices down to historical profit levels on a per industry basis. So, and what would have been the correct policy for central banks? That's a little bit more difficult question to answer, but I'll give it a shot. First of all, let me preface the answer by saying that, as I said at the top of the Zoom, monetary policy is about interest rates. Keynes once said, central bank's going to have any interest rate it wants. And I think that's correct. Can the Federal Reserve bring interest rates down to zero, for example, tomorrow? And the answer is yes. I think there's nothing that prevents central banks from bringing down interest rates. Now, will there be consequences to that? Yes, most probably, especially perhaps on the exchange rate. um, and maybe other advantages or benefits to that. But those are different questions. Can the central bank reduce interest rate to zero? Yes, it can. Will it have consequences? Perhaps. And depending on whether you want to live with those consequences or not, will inform your decision. But the central bank does control the rate of interest. Look at what happened in Japan. Um, in the post-COVID era, when central banks around the world raised interest rates to austere levels, Japan resisted a lot, raised the interest rates a little bit, but nothing compared to that to other countries, and it did suffer. But it was able to keep interest rates down, not a problem, but it had consequences, especially on its currency. So two separate questions. But yes, central banks could bring interest rates down to zero tomorrow. And not to agree with Donald Trump, um, this is what Donald Trump has been saying for the past 2 years. Bring those interest rates down. Maybe Trump is a post-Keynesian, I don't know. But the idea was that he was essentially correct. Bring those interest rates down. I'm a fan of bringing down interest rates. In fact, I've written a series of papers where I argue, you know, interest rates should be brought down to a low level on a more or less permanent basis. Bring interest rates down to something and leave it there for long periods and let fiscal policy do the heavy lifting of economic adjustments. I'm a Keynesian, so of course I'll say that. But I think that fiscal policy is way more effective in managing inflation, or could be, and managing the economy than monetary policy. There's all sorts of things wrong with the use of monetary policy. Does aggregate demand really is aggregate demand really impacted by interest rates? That's a difficult question, and the answer is not very obvious when you look at the data. I think that especially investment decisions are determined by other variables other than interest rates. The data will show that investment decisions don't respond well to interest rates. Now, let me clarify. I think investment decisions don't adjust well to incremental changes in interest rates. But if you bring interest rates up 10 times, 11 times, 12 times, 13 times, yes, then you definitely risk collapsing the economy. But even that story is suspicious because look what happened post-COVID in the United States. Biden had a huge fiscal expansion policy, which has been continued under Trump. And despite the interest rate having been increased 11 times, the economy still grew. And that was because of the fiscal stimulus. So it's difficult, I think, to identify a clear negative relationship between interest rates and investment, especially incremental changes. But after many changes, I'm open to that discussion. I think investments as a Keynesian are determined by expectations of future levels of aggregate demand rather than interest rates. So the use of monetary policy, I'm not sure what the use of monetary policy is in terms of fighting inflation and regulating economic activity. Now, I think that a lot of people in the mainstream have sort of moved away from that argument precisely for those reasons. And that's where I think the arguments of expectations have come up in the theory of monetary policy. So many people believe that it's more important to anchor expectations in order to prevent inflation. And that would mean, especially, workers should anchor their expectations that it's important for the central bank to keep inflation down because that will keep wage demands down. But there's a very good economist at the New York Fed by the name of Rudd, who's done a lot of exciting work showing that expectations play very little role in inflation. Um, so, so I think that the whole sort of mainstream citadel of monetary policy has collapsed. Um, and I think for the better informed mainstream people, I think they're very aware of that. Look at when interest rates came down to zero. They were desperate to, once interest rates are at zero, presumably, there's nothing for central banks to do anymore. Like interest rates are at zero. So you had a push in mainstream to try to find new ways for central banks to be relevant when interest rates were zero. Well, that's when quantitative easing comes in. That's where negative interest rates came in. All of these new sort of policies. And I think that that's because they were desperate. They were desperate to show what more can we do? And then when interest rates were at zero or in the so-called liquidity trap, where we know and investment weren't reacting to low interest rates. That's because the uncertain environment was so rotten. The expectations of growth in the future was absent. Who wanted to invest in a new plant during a COVID crisis or during a financial crisis? So expectations play much better role um, than interest rates. Now, that was sort of the post-COVID environment. And now today, what's going to happen? Inflation is going back up. Trump is demanding lower interest rates. There's a new Fed chair, Kevin Walsh. What is he going to do? I mean, he was appointed by Trump. He's very well aware, and I'm sure Trump and him spoke at length about bringing down interest rates. What's going to happen to Fed policy now? Well, I don't know. Kevin Walsh is known as being an inflation hawk. He's not a fan of inflation. So, theoretically, or his views would be to raise interest rates, but he's going against the political views of Trump. And I'm not sure exactly where that's going to land. It's going to be very interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see what other central banks will do with this, mini increase in inflation in the last 6, 7 months. And that was because of the oil embargo and what's happening in the Middle East. But in this case, I think most central banks will argue that inflation is temporary and they're not going to rush to raise interest rates. That would be my guess. They're definitely not going to lower it. I mean, there's a conundrum. In Canada, we're technically in a recession right now, 2 consecutive negative quarters of growth. So we're technically in a recession, which would presumably demand that interest rates come down. But the inflation is above target of 2%. So it's not sure. I just want to say something about the target of 2%. I saw this tweet yesterday on Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, by a monetarist. And he was saying, oh, inflation is 3.8% above the 2% target. We have to raise interest rates. Let me point out that this 2% target is imaginary. I mean, I published a paper, I published an opinion in the Guardian, and let me just that was my alarm for the original time I was given of 11. Uh, there you go. Um, yeah, I wrote this piece for the Guardian, and so in which I argued that there's no theoretical reason to have a target of 2%, and that matters. I mean, I reject all these mainstream things. But if I were a mainstream, and if the target was 3%, it would make a difference. Inflation at 3.8, it's not that far away from target, but it is much further away from a target of 2%. So this target of 2% was chosen just out of thin air, if you believe the New Zealand Central Bank, which were the first to inflation target. But it, there's absolutely no research, and I dare anybody to find the research justifying a 2% target. There is no research on that. So it's an artificial environment created to justify a model that I think is very weak to begin with. So that's where we are at now. Not sure what's going to happen with interest rates moving forward, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. Okay, that's it.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your comments on the monetary policy and interest rate, and as well as talk about the inflation. So right now, I will give the floor to the audience for common question. If you have any question, you can raise your hand and then let's talk. Cedric, please go first.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time once again. If I have followed, because in between it's a lot of rain and thunder over here, so I got disconnected in between. So if I have understood correctly, you have discussed briefly about two blunt instruments that we have, fiscal policy and interest rate.
No, I don't think fiscal policy is a blunt instrument.
Okay, this is my adjective. Sorry. But there is another speculation. I will say speculation because I don't know the science behind it. Is that the Trump's insistence on lowering interest rate had something to do with the intention to influence the exchange rate, because it's the reserve currency of the world. So the price of the dollar should be in such a would be at a level that he's or the United States is comfortable with. My first question is, do you see any logic or science behind it? And the second is about, because we see these two instruments as if these are two levers, and if we can pull and push or do something, and then as if we are the master of the economy and we can influence it. Whereas there is so many variable which sometimes makes us believe that how can we control so many things in an economy? So the question would be, are they sufficient? And the second is, are they scientific enough or political enough? Or are they scientific or political? Or am I clear? Yeah.
So going back, normally when you bring interest rates down, you're going to have capital flight, and that's going to affect your currency. I'm not necessarily sure that works for the United States. Because it's the reserve currency, because it's considered a safe haven, because it is the first destination of capital flight, a flight to safety. I don't think it necessarily applies to the United States. My interpretation is that Trump wants to bring down interest rates more in order to help the American household. Especially now we're in a year of midterm elections. A lot of Republicans will probably lose their seats, both in the House and in the Senate. But lowering interest rates might, in his mind, maybe work a little bit to get, to help some Republicans. But I think that all this is political. All this is political, and even fiscal policy is political. The scientific explanation for fiscal policy is fixed income inequality. We know that when income inequality shrinks, that has a positive aggregate demand effect on growth. That would be the scientific explanation, but that's not what fiscal policy is about. It's as political as anything else. I mean, I believe that income inequality is easy to fix. I believe unemployment is easy to fix. I believe homelessness is easy to fix. What's the solution to homelessness? Build more affordable housing. What's the solution to income inequality? Well, raise the tax rates on higher income individuals, or tax inheritance, or tax. Easy. There you go, easy. But it's not done for political reasons. And I think that all of these previous mentioned policies would have clear economic benefits, if not social and ethical benefits. You solve homelessness, you've done. And a wonderful thing, the idea that a human should not sleep on the street is somehow something that politicians completely turn their backs on. So there's a lack of morality in politics, and these are political issues. They're economic issues as well, but these are, not done for political reasons.
Thank you,
There's
Henry.
a question in the chat before I go to Mitra. I think it was.
No.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Hello, Rakia.
Hello.
Okay. I have a rather unorthodox view of interest rate policies. Would you say it would be possible for the world economy to function without utilizing interest rates? Just countries have nominal fixed U.S. peg on the U.S. credit. Well, yeah. I mean, I think interest rates are more detrimental than anything, especially when used incorrectly, used by central bankers who don't really understand. And this is a question because central banks have this access to the exact same data as I do and as everyone else does. And they must be aware of the low impact of interest rates on aggregate demand, for example. But I think it's a question of theoretical faith. This is what they learned, and they use it, and I think they use it incorrectly. Could we move forward without using interest rates? That's a good question. I mean, let me be clear. I don't want to minimize the impact of interest rates. I think it has, impact on a number of things. But I don't know if you can keep all world interest rates fixed or pegged to. It's a good question. I'd have to think more about it. Mitra.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your talk, Professor. I'm interested in the political and international dimensions of monetary policy. From a post-Keynesian perspective, if interest rate policy is not neutral, but redistributes income and power domestically, as you mentioned, how should we think about the Federal Reserve's global role, especially its effects on the global south through dollar dependency, debt servicing, exchange rates, and political flows. If U.S. monetary policy also, do you find U.S. monetary policy also a mechanism of international economic discipline? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the U.S., what the Fed does, other countries look at. And as I just said before, it has implications for capital flows, yes. It has implications for exchange rates, yes. It has implications for a number of things. And the problem with exchange rates, that's the blunt instrument, is that they don't understand the intricate and complicated machine of monetary policy, so that they just raise interest rates to 5%, and then they risk collapsing the economy. I'm struggling to remember what else you wanted to ask. It'll come back to me. Sorry. There's a question here by Claudio Ferri. If I rely on fiscal policy, what are my concerns about public debt? I think a lot has been made about public debt, and to what degree is it scientific or just plain hysteria? There was that paper by Reynard and Rogoff arguing that if the public debt to GDP was 90% and above, it would lead to a collapse of the economy. That proved to be wrong. That proved to be bad econometrics and bad theory. For that reason, I think Rogoff will never win the Nobel Prize. Nevertheless, the argument has shifted to, well, forget that level, that specific 90% level. Can an increase in public debt really ruin a country? Well, my quick answer to that is Japan. The public debt in Japan is 250%. You'd have to look up the precise level. The United States is approaching 100. And the world is not collapsing. The world may be collapsing under Trump's tariffs and other policies. But with respect to the public debt, and public debts tend to fluctuate. I know that COVID, it went up, it came down after COVID, so they tend to fluctuate a bit. And especially when interest rates are low. So here's another reason to have a good, sensible monetary policies to keep interest rates low. The service on the debt is much lower, and basically, what justified or allowed many countries to get into such fiscal spending during COVID was because interest rates were zero. So it was sort of free money or interest-free money, call it what you want. But I'm not too worried about levels of public debt. I think that the question masks the important role the state has in public investments. Now, also, it depends, how is that public debt incurred? Is it through government current accounts or capital accounts? So, if you build a new electrical grid that's going to benefit society for the next 50 years, that's good debt. So if you work on infrastructure, there's a million projects the government can work on. So I think that there's a counterbalance to the public debt, which is two things, which is presumably better infrastructure that will be the legacy to our grandchildren. And the second thing about the public debt that we have to remember is that it's a great asset for many people. Who buys the public debt? You do. So you, the citizen, the worker, the household, you're actually making money from public debt. Now, I would be a little bit concerned if the vast majority of owners of public debt are foreigners, in which case now money is just flowing out. But in Brazil, for example, 85% is owned by Brazilians. And it would be, without having looked up the Canadian number, but it would be more or less the same, maybe a little bit higher for Canada. So when the government spends and creates public debt and then floats bonds to finance it, guess who buys that? We benefit from the public debt. And not to mention the important role government bonds play in safe havens. When stock markets are going wild, people put their money, one of the places is in bonds. It's a safe place. So public debt plays, and the financing of public debt plays quite a many important role.
Thank you, Professor. So, do anyone have comment or question you can ask? If not, maybe I can ask a question, but I'm not sure really the question because as I listen to you and we can see that addressing social issues or the issue regarding to the money is not only the role of monetary policy, but it also linked to another social development policy, fiscal policy. And through that, the challenge is not about the policy, but it's also about the political will from the leader who control the government. And it is hard because it also need to collect people that who has the same interest to engage the leader to address any social issue that is requires a social movement or something. I don't know. And what is your opinion if we can change their policy and make some more people access to public service, more comfortable house for lower income household, because it is all of that very hard to do. And yeah.
What's your question?
The question is what kind of mechanism from economists that can implement to the policymaker or the leader, how they can do better in order to support economic development and lower income household.
Well, there's a number of fiscal policies that can be used.
Fiscal policy.
Yeah, we can sit down, and anyone, if we sat down for 15 minutes, we could probably come up with 25 great policy ideas to implement, to help the poor, the working poor, social housing, etc. There's really no limit to that. Keynes has a great quote. He says, anything we can do, we can afford to do. So it's not a question, to go back to the idea of the public debt. It's not the idea of straining fiscal space. Governments can governments can solve problems, and it will cost, but it's not something prohibitive. I don't think so. It can always be managed. But what I do want to say is, there's been a lot of talks in recent years about central banks trying to solve income inequality or the climate crisis, green bonds, etc. And I also have done research on monetary policy and income distribution. But I think it's important to recognize that monetary policy may have side effects on income inequality, on the climate, okay? But I don't think the central bank should try to solve anything. That's fiscal policy. That's the government's role. I think the monetary policy should be about the health of the financial system, the health of the interbank lending facilities. Um, that's what the central bank monetary policy is about. It should not be to bring solutions to help. They were talking a lot about unconventional policies, quantitative easing for the people. I think that's just a ridiculous idea. Certainly not very post-Keynesian. And again, if anything, that's fiscal policy. I don't think monetary policy or central banks should get into the business of doing fiscal policy.
Thank you so much. I got your point and very great comment on that. So any other comment, please ask. And if not, maybe we can close the session because, Cedric, please go ahead.
I have a very short question. I mean, there are people who believe the central bank should be intervening as much as possible to the economic activity within a country, and there are people who says that hands off as much as you can. So, in your personal opinion, which side would you like to take? Are you among those who believe in too much, if I use the word micromanaging, or you want to?
Well, so I think that that's a red herring. I think it's a wrong question in the sense that it's not should central banks intervene more or less. They intervene constantly. Constantly. I'm thinking of two levels. When they adopt an interest rate, that's the interest rate. It's an interest rate target, for the lack of a better word, 2%, 3%. But if you look at the interest rate in the market, they'll deviate a little bit from that. So the central bank will intervene once, twice a day to inject or withdraw funds in order to force the market rate to converge to the central bank benchmark rate. One. The second thing is the central bank negotiates and works very closely with the Treasury on a continual basis. So, I mean, their operations are linked. MMT has said a lot about this. So the idea that central banks are very interventionist by very nature. So those who argue that, but I think maybe underneath your question is a question about central bank independence. Should central banks be independent? I don't know. The one thing I do know is the data shows that so-called independent central banks, countries with independent central banks, don't necessarily have a better economic performance, first of all. The second thing is I really find funny when people applaud when central banks defend inflation. The idea, it's this idea that there's a relationship between monetary policy and inflation, which I don't think is there. But this is sort of this theoretical faith that I spoke about before. People believe that exists, and therefore, if it's true, and second thing, they think inflation is really dangerous because it debases the value of your currency. Maybe. I think inflation may be a problem because it makes it difficult for people to buy groceries. I mean, that's where the problem of inflation is when I go to the grocery store and my chicken that was $10 is now $20. That's the problem of inflation. But what in these models, when you talk to people in financial circles, etc., why is inflation such a bad problem relative to unemployment? What's wrong with a central bank saying we want full employment, we want to create jobs? What's wrong with a central bank who wants to put less emphasis on inflation and more emphasis on unemployment? Since when is inflation a worse problem than unemployment? So, is there something inherently wrong with Trump wanting to bring interest rates down so it can help the economy? No, I don't think so. So, should governments be hands off with central banks? I don't know. I don't know. I would really, what if the policy that central banks pursue is the wrong policy? So we're letting independent central banks pursue wrong and potentially dangerous policies. Someone's got to step in at some time and say, hey, you've gone too far. Yes, that's going to have repercussions on financial markets and all of that. But anyways, there you go. That's my answer.
And I just wanted to clarify you why I asked this question, because Indian central bank has a tendency to kind of manage the exchange rate. And in order to do that, it will spend enormous amount of money up to the limit of $40 billion in a year. And by doing so, it will also make money out of this manipulation and then give the money back to Indian government as a bonus or profit sharing. So that's the reason why there will be conversation. Oh, you're intervening too much.
Yeah.
Let the exchange. Yeah. So that's the reason. Yeah. And thank you for connecting it to the independence, because like in India, I'm sorry, I'm bringing India because I'm based in India. So there was a perceived independence between the central bank and the state, fiscal thing that state is doing. But now what happened, the politics has changed, and then the politicians are appointing people who will listen more. So central bank and now the Ministry of Finance is working more closely than before. So this kind of debate is always there in Indian questions. So I was tempted to ask you. Thank you for the question. Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. A bit noise in my place, so I think maybe we can close the session, and really appreciate for your time. And I know that you have a very busy week this week in Brazil for a conference or lecture. I'm not sure, but
I just gave a talk yesterday, which was very well attended, on whether Keynes was a socialist. So
yes, I saw the LinkedIn post. And they have a better poster than ours.
It's a competition about posters.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So